Sports Talk Chicago. Here with Jon Zaghloul, and we are back and ready for today's special guest. He's the Football Morning in America columnist for NBC Sports and the host of the Peter King podcast. Please welcome Peter King to the program. Peter, it's great to have you on. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well, John. Thanks for having me, and thanks for reaching out.
What do you make of the Rams Super Bowl win, first off?
I think that their great players played great when they really had to. And I mean, Cooper Kupp really came through at the end when Odell Beckham Jr. was hurt, and Aaron Donald came through even against double teams. So I think there's a moral to the story. There are a lot of general managers and a lot of traditional football people who don't love the way the Rams were built. They don't think you can build a championship team doing it mainly through big names, big salaries, veteran kind of famous players. And I think the Rams are going to cause a lot of people to say, hey, listen, this is not a bad idea. It's just a different idea.
That also applies to draft picks, too. They don't have many first-round draft picks moving forward, and they were still able to win.
I mean, the weird thing about the whole draft pick deal is that Sean McVay got hired in 2017. And in the 5 drafts since then, 17 through 21, the Rams have had the second highest number of draft choices in football. Just none of them in the first round. So it's like everybody thinks they're trading away their future, but basically what they do is they draft a bunch of guys, like, for instance, Nick Scott. He's a safety. He went to Penn State. They drafted him in the 7th round of 19, thinking of him basically as mostly a special teams player. And honestly, that's what he was for a couple of years, but they had injuries at safety this year, and they needed him, and they decided we're going to put him in the game. And for the last month of the season, he was absolutely terrific. So I think a lot of what people think about the Rams is it sounds good to say that, they don't have enough draft picks or whatever, but they got a lot of draft picks. They don't have a lot of high draft picks. And I think their attitude is that they'd rather have Jalen Ramsey and Matthew Stafford and Von Miller than a bunch of 1s and 2s and 3s, because those guys were 3 of the 8 or 10 most important people on a team that just won the Super Bowl.
How impressed were you with Aaron Donald's play?
Well, I think in so many ways, Super Bowls are supposed to be where the best players play the best. But very often, and I think probably most often, that doesn't really happen. But in this game, in the second half of this game, Aaron Donald made 3 monster plays to help his team win. And I think that really becomes sort of the moral of the story in this game, that your best players, if you are a star-built team, your best players have to play the best for you to win. And Aaron Donald, he made his best 2 plays of the game in the last 2 plays of the game. So, I mean, he came through when he was supposed to, and that's what great players do.
Peter King here on Sports Talk Chicago. Peter, where does Aaron Donald rank now with this Super Bowl amongst all-time defensive tackles?
Well, I wrote in my Football Morning in America column this week that basically Aaron Donald now has been a 3-time Defensive Player of the Year, and he's been first-team All-Pro 5 times. There are 6 players who were named to the NFL 100-year anniversary team who are defensive tackles. none of those players had more first team all pros or more defensive players of the year. So to me, I think you put him up there with the best defensive tackles of all time.
He's a surefire Hall of Famer, right?
Oh, he was probably that 2 years ago, but yeah, he's a walk-in Hall of Famer now.
What about Matthew Stafford? There's been a lot of talk about his candidacy following the Super Bowl win. Do you put him in that class yet, or what more does he need to do to get there?
Play football. I mean, in my opinion, so look, I'm one of the voters for the Hall of Fame. And one of the things that I kind of shake my head when issues like this come up after somebody has a great postseason. This isn't the first time. But I sort of shake my head because the question really is twofold. You could ask the question, if he never plays another game, is he a Hall of Famer? Because that's what you're asking, really. You're saying, has Matthew Stafford now done enough to make the Hall of Fame? And I would say it's a resounding no. But if he plays 3, 4, 5 more years at this level, advances in the playoffs a couple of times, whether he gets another ring or not, I think he has a pretty good chance. But this is a guy who right now, as of today, has played 13 seasons. The first 12, he never won a playoff game. He never was on a division winner. So when he, in year 13, gets traded to a team and is part of a team that wins a Super Bowl, does that automatically make him a Hall of Famer? There would not have been one soul on planet Earth a year ago today who would have said that Matthew Stafford's a Hall of Fame player. Just because he has this 1 year, now he's got all this momentum to make the Hall of Fame. Plus, you have to look at the fact that there's probably 15 to 17 quarterbacks in this era of football. And when I say this era, I mean who had their prime between 2005 and 2030. So that's a 25-year era. And I'm including guys like Mahomes and Josh Allen. But all those guys who have their primes, are you going to put everyone in the Hall of Fame? You putting Dak Prescott in? You putting, so you putting Phillip Rivers in? You putting everybody in? And maybe you are, and which is okay if you think everybody should be in there. But that's not traditionally the way the Hall of Fame has inducted people.
How do you feel about this year's Hall of Fame class?
I loved it because I think, as a voter for the Hall of Fame, I love when a great player who doesn't get recognized for his greatness, like Sam Mills, gets recognized. I mean, here's a guy who played 15 years of professional football, led every team he played for, the 3 teams he played for, led everyone to the playoffs, was a defensive captain on every team he led to the playoffs. When he went to Carolina at the end of his career, at age 37, he led his team in tackles and led his team to the playoffs. And at age 38, he had 43 more tackles than anybody else on his playoff team did. And I mean, you're 38 years old and you've got 43 more tackles than anybody on your team. That to me is a great player. And I think a lot of people over the years held the fact against him that, he didn't win. He was not on a Super Bowl champion and he was 5'9". So how can you be a great player if you're 5'9"? Well, when he left New Orleans, Jim Mora, the coach who only coached for about 1,000 years, said that's the best football player I've ever coached in my life. So I don't know. I like it when guys like that get in the Hall of Fame.
What about Devin Hester? Why didn't he get in this year?
I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons probably, but look, I make a list. I make a list from 1 to 15 every year of the Hall of Fame before the voting begins. I say here's how I think they land 1-15. Now, I might change my mind during the course of the proceedings, but this year at the start of the process, I had Devin Hester number 2 on my list. I voted for him the whole way. He didn't get enough votes. I think he will get in the Hall of Fame. I think what probably is against him somewhat is that he was a mediocre wide receiver when he did play wide receiver. He was never very rarely great at that position. My whole thing is I've covered the NFL for 38 years. He's the best returner I've seen. And so I think if you do one thing better than anybody else, and it's a major part of the game, I'm good with putting you in the Hall of Fame, and I hope he gets in soon.
How does the Hall of Fame process work? Like, I know there are conversations, discussions. How did it work this year when it came to Hester and the other guys, and did that have a role to play with it too?
Oh, it always does. You basically have to, you go through a discussion period where all 15 modern era finalists are discussed. After maybe 4 or 5 hours of discussion, you vote for your top 10. Then an accounting firm would, and you do that privately, you do it secretly. Then an accounting firm comes back and says, okay, here's the 10. And then you vote again. You vote for your top 5. And then it comes down to 5. And at that point, you have to vote yes or no on each of the 5. And that's how it works. And, you know, there was a lot of discussion about Devin Hester, and I thought it was good, healthy discussion. At some point, my gut feeling, having done it for a while, is that he'll get in, but we'll see.
Was that the main contention, what you mentioned earlier, that he was a mediocre wide receiver? Did that come up in the discussions a lot, or?
I mean, certainly everything comes up in the discussion, but, you know, it really depends. Like I said, to me, I don't really care about that. Would it have been great if he had 110 touchdown catches and was all-pro wide receiver 3 times? Of course. But that's not what we have. I'm a believer that you look at everybody's career is different. Everybody does different things. And Devin Hester did one thing better than anybody I've ever seen. In my mind, he's an easy Hall of Famer.
Peter King here on Sports Talk Chicago. Peter, let's talk Bears for a second. What do you make of their hirings at head coach and GM?
Well, you know, I don't know either man. And so that's a job that I've got to get done. I got to get to know them, hopefully starting at the scouting combine. But I like the fact that Ryan Poles came up the right way. I mean, he was hired by the Kansas City Chiefs when Scott Pioli was the general manager as a low on the totem pole guy. He had worked at Boston College. And, you know, he has basically paid his dues every step of the way. I happen to think that the Kansas City organization is fantastic at training people and at how they scout people, how they scout players. So I think he was trained well there by Andy Reid and Brett Veach. And as far as Matt Eberflus goes, you know, the Bears went against the grain, needing help for their young quarterback, and drafted the guy who they felt was the best head coach available. And when he basically when he got hired, it said to me that he had to blow away the competition in the interview process, because I bet a lot of money that the Bears entered the process thinking, hey, we hope it's an offensive guy. We hope it's a guy who can take Justin Fields and the franchise to the promised land. So we'll see how that works. I've always been impressed with him and his schemes, and his players, especially in Indianapolis, really loved him. So, we'll see what happens.
How do you evaluate Justin Fields' rookie season overall? What do you see from him?
Remember sitting with Matt Nagy before a preseason game in the Bears Hotel in downtown Chicago. And he had a message to deliver that day. And his message was, I'm not playing this kid until he's ready. I don't care what's going on with our team. I'm not out to get this guy a 2-year career. I want him to get a 15-year career. And that's how he really tried to do it. And I think, I mean, look, the media is part of this. Fans are part of this. It's one of the things I don't love about football today. There's so much incredible pressure on a head coach to play a first-round quarterback. And who cares if Justin Fields plays this year? You're not winning the Super Bowl. You're almost certainly not going to the playoffs. I mean, you know, the Bengals were 4-10-1 or whatever they were, I forget. But they won 4 games in Burrow's rookie year, even though he did get hurt, you know, 2/3 of the way through. I just think that Nagy had the right idea. Injuries and an enormous earthquake of public sentiment kind of forced his hand. I think it's a mistake, but then again, I don't make those decisions.
You find at least some sort of growth, some positivity based on what you saw from Justin Fields?
I mean, you can't help but grow and get better in the course of your year if you're being taught the right way. And look, I understand Matt Nagy is about as popular in Chicago as whatever is unpopular. But, you know, he had something to do with Patrick Mahomes. And I know everybody's sick of hearing that. And I get it. But, you know, the fact is that he didn't choose Mitch Trubisky. And he had a lot to do with Justin Fields. And I think that his whole idea was, let's do this quarterback the way we did Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City. They didn't do that. Now, I'm sure that there are some positives that are going to come out of Justin Fields' first year. But I'm a big believer in, you know, the power of learning and being extremely confident in yourself as a player by the time you play, especially at the quarterback position. And it didn't quite work out that way for them.
Could he have developed bad habits last year? I mean, he had 7 touchdowns, 10 picks, lots of fumbles. Is that a concern now, knowing the Bears rushed him and put him in too early?
I mean, we'll see. I mean, it's easy to sit here and say, yeah, that's a bad sign. And that's, you know, we'll see. What's done is done. As I say, I think it would have been better if he sat the year. But at the end of the day, and look, I'll never figure out why, if they weren't going to use Nick, I mean, they were going to use, obviously, Andy Dalton. But if they were going to use Nick Foles, unless it was an absolute emergency, I don't really understand that. Why do you have him on the roster? I would have played Nick Foles a long time before he really did play.
What do you expect out of the Bears come next year now with the new offense, new head coach, new GM, and the potential for growth?
I think some of that really depends on the growth of guys like Justin Fields. You know, what's always interesting is that, you know, like right now, everybody said, okay, it's, you know, I'll give you a Giants example. Daniel Jones, you know, this is make or break year. Well, for Daniel Jones, this will be his 3rd new offense in 4 years. I mean, you cannot expect people to hit the ground running when they learn something new. And I think that is really one of the most interesting things to watch for this year. How quickly can Justin Fields adapt to new coaching, some new players, but a lot of return players. So I think that'll tell the tale. I think they'll be very good on defense, but they're not going to win that division unless their offense takes some giant steps.
Or unless Aaron Rodgers leaves, right?
Yeah, but even if he does leave, yeah, I mean, you know, you're right. I mean, if he does leave, it's wide open. But if he leaves, I think Minnesota's the best team in the division. Chicago might be. I guess it Depends how many 13 to 10 games can you win, because they'll need to win a few.
Peter King, still here on Sports Talk Chicago. Peter, a few more questions before we finish up. First off, your career. How'd you get your start?
I never had any intention of being a sports writer. I went to Ohio University, and I never wrote sports there. I mean, I wrote a few sports stories, but hardly any. And I thought I would be covering the State House in Columbus, or I don't know. I just thought I'd be writing news somewhere. And then I got a job offer 9 months after I retired from a guy in Cincinnati who had been my news editor in my internship, and he got the sports editor's job, and he wanted to hire me as a general assignment writer. And so that's what I did. And, it's really been sort of my good fortune that I got that job and I got hired at that time, because really, we're all, what's the right word to say? We all have experiences in our lives that shape us. And if the first job I had gotten was a general assignment reporter for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, I'd probably be covering news somewhere right now. I don't know, but that's how it started. And then, I think the other thing that I think was important to me is that I never went looking for a job, not once. I never applied for jobs. I never did that at all, because I always thought, I was told this in college, that your work will be your resume. And that's how I always felt. That's how I always tried to manage my work life. That, people are watching, people will know you. And at some point, if you're any good, you'll climb the ladder. And that's kind of what happened with me.
I'm curious, what made you gravitate towards football? Because you never played football. You played 3 different sports in high school. You were really good at all those 3. So what made you gravitate towards the NFL and becoming this big-time writer for the league?
When I started at the Inquirer, Cincinnati Inquirer in 1980, I was the backup beat writer on the Cincinnati Reds. And at the time, they had 4 daily writers: the Dayton Daily News, the Dayton Journal-Herald, the Cincinnati Post, and the Cincinnati Inquirer. So I became friends with all those guys, and every one of them was divorced. I was married. We were planning a family. We were thinking about it. And I just said, okay, it's one thing to be the backup guy on the team and you go on 1 10-day road trip a year. It's another thing to be gone for half of 7 months every year. And so I just decided that even though my sporting preference was baseball, I decided to go into a more sane lifestyle job. And they had an opening to cover the Bengals in 1984. And I raised my hand and they said, good, go do it. So that's kind of how that happened.
What's the greatest moment you've ever covered in your career?
The greatest what?
Greatest moment you've ever covered.
I probably would say that, it was pretty cool. I covered the Olympics in Korea early in my career when I worked for a paper called Newsday. And I broke a story about the guy who won the 100-meter dash, Ben Johnson, testing positive for steroids. And that at the time was a very big deal. And so I don't know. I've had a lot of really fun memories and covered a lot of fun games in my life. But if I were asked to pick one, that happened at a time in my life where I was just a pup. I was the last of 5 reporters for Newsday, this paper I worked for in New York covering the Olympics. And I don't think it was luck. I think I followed a lead that I had and it ended up working out and all that. So those are the things that are memorable to me.
Peter, before we finish up today, last question. Is there a funny moment that you've been a part of during your career too?
I mean, I would say, a funny moment. I would say that one of the funniest things that ever happened to me was that I covered the Super Bowl that the Green Bay Packers won back in '97. And at the end of it, Brett Favre told me he was going to give me some time. And so I kind of followed him around the locker room. He said, I'll get to you. Then all of a sudden, he's on the bus back to the Fairmont Hotel in New Orleans, and I haven't gotten him. So first, I'm ticked off, okay? But I said, this is not over, And so I went to the Fairmont Hotel. There were 4,000 people at the victory party. And I went in there, it was probably about midnight, and I went in there and I looked in every inch of the place. And finally I saw Favre, and Favre looked at me and said, basically, I know. So we both looked around, and he points to an exit. And it was a fire escape. And in that exit was a bellman's luggage cart. He sat on one side of the cart, I sat on the other side. And we just ended up talking for 45 minutes. And he said, well, now I can tell everybody I won the Super Bowl, and I celebrated by sitting on this bleeping luggage cart with you. So that was kind of funny.
Peter, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate the time. Best wishes with NBC Sports, with your podcast too, and looking forward to the next time we chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John. Appreciate it.